A warm and sincere welcome to CG's conference on remaking higher education for a more equal world. And what a year it's been. A year in which higher education's really reasserted its value and its contribution across the world in many ways. The value of face-to-face learning has been strongly asserted once it was not always available to us. And I think the desire for community to re-establish direct contact is a powerful norm across the world. Every time that face-to-face experience is restricted, there's that pushback, this desire to resume it, and clearly we'll all be back there if we're not already back there as soon as possible. But brilliant use made of online in many countries and many institutions, and we've also found, of course, the limitations of the medium, the way in which infrastructure, devices are not fully available across the world. In fact, for most people, devices are not available that allow you to sufficiently access higher education in depth. And rolling out that infrastructure and rolling out that availability of devices then becomes a key policy imperative for countries in the future. The resilience of the sector has been really highlighted by the pandemic, and not only in relation to teaching and learning, but also in relation to research, where people have kept programs going under difficult conditions at times, and also, of course, cooperated in new areas, but using electronic links. And the value of global research has never been more obvious than in the development of the COVID-19 vaccines in only 12 months. No one expected that to happen, but that was really premised on the exchange of information in relation to the basic science, the basic biometric science of the virus, and that in that cooperation, people work together across the geopolitical divides which are opening up between the US and China. And we saw a really strong assertion, I think, of the value of scientific globalism as opposed to technological nationalism in relation to the pandemic. International students have had a particularly difficult period, and some were stranded for long periods in their country of education, unable to go home. Others unable to reach their country of education despite the fact that they'd committed to a program and they paid fees and so on. Others arrived in their country of education only to find severe restrictions on their capacity to access face-to-face education, to meet people, to develop their knowledge of the country they're in, and so on. Very tough time. But I think, again, you know, the value and the desire for international education strongly reasserted in this period, and it will spring back, if it hasn't already sprung back, as we move away from the worst of the pandemic. The experience of the pandemic has been very uneven. I mean, I think issues related to care and mental health have been common to all of us, but in some countries, the pandemic has been worse than others. I mean, particularly India and Nepal at the moment are going through a really terrible time in relation not only to higher education, but society in general, and the death toll and the burden of care for families is enormous. And and we really feel for students and faculty who are carrying a lot of the grunt work in terms of keeping communities going, getting basic healthcare to people, as well as looking after their own families. You know, our thoughts are very much with our friends in South Asia and other parts of the world, as in South America and Africa, where the pandemic is still particularly rife. The pandemic period has asserted the importance of higher education for the public good. I mean, the way in which people in higher education play such important community maintenance and community building role in this time is obvious, but also in another way, in that the countries where higher education is seen as a public good and a common shared benefit, not just simply a benefit for individuals. It's in those countries where higher education has proven to be most stable, which will come out of the pandemic best in terms of the operation of their higher education and research systems, where they're not reduced to the situation of, in very difficult circumstances, chasing enrolments to keep going and so on. Countries which have adopted a market-based approach to higher education provision have been countries where the sector has been much more unstable and has struggled in some cases just to function. And, you think of the closures of private education in Japan and Korea, the difficulties being faced in the United States in some institutions at the moment. It shows that societies which value their higher education system centrally and politically and put it at the core of public policy are societies which get the best benefits from it and the best returns from it. Well, we've got a full program. For a full program of discussion of a range of issues. We'll be showcasing our own Centre for Global Higher Education research projects, but we'll also be running sessions which go to higher education issues in general, both in the UK and across the world. And we've got two brilliant keynotes in this afternoon from the World Bank's Coordinator for Tertiary Education and the Director of Strategy on Widening Participation in England, Roberta Maley-Bassett and Chris Millward in succession, and it's tremendous keynotes, and they'll be very interesting sessions. It's a participative conference with many opportunities for you to speak and to share in the main sessions in the Q&A component and in the breakout sessions. We're going to run the discussions in main sessions for another 40 minutes or so in each time in breakout sessions while the new session is starting. You'll have the opportunity to post your thoughts, to network with others and conduct your own meetings throughout these 2 half-day periods that the conference is running. Now, before I move to some housekeeping, let me at the outset express a heartfelt thanks to our CG Communications Officer, Trevor Trehan, who has done so much to prepare today and tomorrow, and also to the folks at Hublot who have developed the conference program, conference platform. And also thanks to Carly Brownbridge and Ellie Gasper at CG, who played a key role in setting up the conference also. Now, to make the best use of the conference, go to the conference platform, starting with the reception desk and the attendee guide, and it's everything you need to know article. The conference includes main sessions. They usually run for 40 to 50 minutes. There's a couple of cases where they're a little bit longer, and there are breaks between the main sessions, so you can pause, and if you are really keen on our conference and you're staying all the way through, you can walk out and use the bathroom and get a cup of tea and take a break between sessions. Now, the main sessions, as I mentioned, are followed by breakout sessions, which have a separate login, but login is easy. Those breakouts will see the main session discussion with the speakers continuing for another 40 minutes or so. There's also lounge sessions, which with specialized topics, which have been created from below, if you like. Those lounge sessions are at 6 p.m. today, and again at the end of the day's program at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Now you can form your own meetings and to discuss your own higher education topics through these facilities. Now you can also use the event feed on the site to post comments, to discuss sessions, to vigorously complain or exclaim with joy, introduce yourself to others, and you can send messages and arrange meetings with other conference participants, and some of us are already receiving those messages coming in. The protocols for participation in sessions appear in the Zoom waiting room, and you can read them before you come in. Remember that all the main sessions are being recorded and will be available via the CG website next week. Please keep yourself muted in the sessions unless you have been invited to ask a question. At that point, we'll invite you to unmute, to turn on your camera and to tell us who you are, where you're from, and then ask you to ask your question. You use the chat function to indicate your desire to come into the session. In other words, we are operating in much the same way as we always do in the regular CG Global webinars. Recorded sessions, normally mute yourself and unmute when you enter the discussion, turn on your camera, and use the chat function to indicate your interest in coming in. And the chair of the sessions can then select participants on the basis of what they're putting forward in the chat. So remember, come in early to the chat and make sure your comment is relevant to the session itself. We see the Q&A as an extension of the discussion opened up by the speakers in the session. Well, I think at this point, we can or perhaps even a fraction early, but that's all right. We can move into our first panel session. Now, in this panel session, it's really an introduction to issues and to the conference. The core topic is remaking higher education. And we've asked leading researchers, all members of our CGHE Research Management Committee, to put forward their thoughts for your thought in relation to remaking higher education. Each person is going to speak for about 4 minutes, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So keep that in mind. Place your questions in the chat and identify the speaker from whom you would like to elucidate an illuminating reply. So it's a great pleasure at this point to move to the first of our panel members. And the first person is Paul Ashwin. Paul is one of the 3 deputy directors of the Centre for Global Higher Education, and he leads CG's project on student learning. Paul is Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. His research interests are focused on the relations between teaching and learning and knowledge curriculum practices in higher education. He works internationally, and he's also a very well-known commentator on learning and teaching, perhaps one of the most respected in the world. He's also a coordinating editor of the journal Higher Education. Paul, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Simon, and welcome everyone to this conference. It's so exciting to see so many people here. So my view on remaking higher education for a more equal world focuses on how higher education can renew its commitment to the stewardship of knowledge for society. How do we make this knowledge available to more people? How do we work with others in society to help them benefit from what this knowledge can do? And this relates to research and engagement, but for me, it's also central to our educational responsibilities as higher education institutions. So when we invite students to study with us, we need to think clearly about who those students are. We need to develop our curricula around students as they really are, rather than taking the attitude of, oh, well, you're not quite ready for higher education. We need to make higher education ready for more people. We need to think about our educational responsibilities seriously. And we need to think about how we can give as many students as possible access to the powerful knowledge that we have. In doing this, we also need to be clear about why this knowledge is powerful and important. When we say to students, come and study with us, come and see what this knowledge can do for you, we need to be clear about what that knowledge can do and where it will take students. We need to be clear about how it will allow students to see the world anew, how it will change students, and how it will enable students to change the world. And we also need to think about where it will take students in their later lives, how it will allow them to contribute to society, including their employment, which is clearly and crucially important for students, but also beyond that, how it will allow them to become people who can make a wider contribution to society. So for me, it's about opening up access to knowledge that allows us to think about how we can remake higher education and contribute to the development of a fairer society. And I'm handing back to you, Simon.
And thanks, Paul. Our second panelist is David Mills, who's a Deputy Director also of CG and Associate Professor in the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. David is a co-investigator on CG's research program on mapping supranational higher education space, which you'll hear more about during the conference. David uses anthropological approaches to study higher education, with a particular focus on African university reform and institutional research cultures. And he'll be well known to many of you because of his active and incisive participation in the CG Global webinars. David.
Thank you very much, Simon, and welcome again to everyone. It's great to have such a great, interesting global gathering and to be talking about remaking higher education. So my pitch for making a more equal world through higher education is to attend briefly to UNESCO's role in promoting initially a series of regional conventions on recognizing higher education qualifications. The reason I'm mentioning this is because we've been thinking quite a lot in our project about the spaces, the supranational spaces that are remaking higher education. And of course, many of us will know about the power of the Lisbon Convention, that in 1997 set in train the transformation of European higher education. But there were many, many conventions before that. In fact, you can go back to the 70s, where UNESCO held conventions in Latin America and the Arab world and the Mediterranean and in Africa in the early 80s. Now, these conventions were similarly trying to encourage states to recognize each other's qualifications. They were very slowly implemented and ratified. The 97 convention was different, partly because there was a shared political will, a commitment to reform and convergence, and it accompanied the Bologna process. Now, why does all this matter, and why might it make for a more equal global higher education? Well, I would say that this most recent initiative by the UNESCO in 2019 to create a first ever global convention on recognition of qualification in higher educations does offer this potential for convergence at a global scale. If it's ratified, as it is ratified by states slowly and implemented, it gives students the right to have their qualifications assessed for admission to further study or employment in another country. In theory, it could really facilitate a more equal academic mobility and improve quality, improve information sharing. This is really overdue, given the speed with which transnational higher education is developing and diversifying. There are many offshore campuses, franchise agreements, institutional partnerships, joint and online dual degrees, distance learning. There's a dizzying range of diversity of higher education provision now. And I think it's a real challenge for countries to keep up with the task of regulation of quality assurance. Now, I know this is not the most exciting necessarily area of HG research, but clearly the mundane work of quality assurance, of reviewing provision, of creating frameworks of standards and benchmarks all really matters. So my pitch then for the way in which global higher education could make for a better and more equal world is this global convention and the conversations and the convergences it could catalyze. I think there's a lot of potential here. So that's something I'd like us all to think about and be aware of during this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our third panelist is Rachel Brooks. Rachel is a CG investigator who works on the Mapping Supranational Higher Education Space Project, and she's a member of CG's Research Management Committee. Rachel is a professor of sociology at University of Surrey, where she specialises in the sociology of higher education, and a member of the education sub-panel for REF 2021, the all-important UK National Research Assessment exercise. Rachel.
Thank you very much, Simon. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Over the past 5 years, I've been conducting a project funded by the European Research Council called Eurostudents. And this has been exploring the ways in which higher education students are conceptualised across 6 European countries: Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland and Spain, examining similarities and differences between nations, but also within them, on the assumption that nations are not always coherent educational entities. And to this end, we've focused on 4 groups of social actor in particular: policy actors, through interviewing policymakers and analysing policy texts; media, through analysing newspaper articles and TV shows that feature students prominently; higher education institutions, through analysing university websites and interviewing staff members; and also, and perhaps most importantly, students themselves. And although it's sometimes argued both in the academic literature and within media commentary that dominant policy discourses can have a direct impact on student subjectivities, so for example, that the introduction of high fees in the UK has led to students taking on consumer-like behaviours, our research indicates that there are often important disconnects between, on the one hand, the views of policymakers and dominant policy constructions of students, and on the other hand, the beliefs of students. So reflecting on these disparities, my suggestion for the remaking of higher education is that we work to reaffirm the latter, i.e. the perspectives of students, and give them more space in public debate. So across the 6 countries in our research, there were 2 particular areas where the gap between policy and student perspective seemed largest and where students were most critical of policy discourse. First, the policy documents we analysed gave a strong message, both explicitly and implicitly, that the primary and overriding purpose of higher education is labour market preparation, and typically position students primarily as future workers. In contrast, while getting a good job after graduation was important to most of the students, their student identity was much more bound up with being a learner than a future worker, and they commonly believed that intellectual and personal development was central to their higher education experience. Many felt that their perspectives were not understood by policymakers or reflected in national debate. So this more expansive understanding of higher education within Europe needs to be articulated more clearly, and we need to find ways of amplifying students' views rather than perhaps assuming students do or should prioritise employment above all else. Second, across all 6 countries, students believed that the humanities and social sciences were frequently devalued within policy and societal discourse, and as a result, there was stigma attached to studying them. Our research participants believed students following these subjects were seen as less intelligent, lazy, and unlikely to be successful in the future, and that these views had a significant impact on those who follow such courses. We need to take action to underline the importance of these areas of inquiry, to ensure that students' voices are heard and that they do not feel stigmatised for following a particular degree subject, but also to underline the role of the university for valuing and generating knowledge across multiple disciplines and domains. Thank you.
And thank you, Rachel. And there's a challenge for all of us. How do we bring students into a more central position in relation to policy and provision in higher education? How can their voices be brought forward and become more instrumental in the way we think about higher education? Our next speaker is Golo Hinseki. Now, Golo is the lead researcher in our all-important project on graduate unemployment and employment, and he focuses on I'm sorry, Maia, I'll come back to you. He focuses on heterogeneity and inequality in the labour market. I'm trying to bring in Golo actually, and I'll come back to Maia. Now, like all the other panelists this morning, Golo is a member of CG's Research Management Committee.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Honestly, I have to say I panicked a bit when I received this brief to think about remaking higher education. Where do you even start? My own alma mater has been around for more than 600 years, and even others are younger. How do you remake something that has been around for such a long time? Some might say stuck in its ways and has spread across the globe and affects so many lives. But Simon already mentioned last year and the many transformations and remaking that have happened, taken place within universities. Universities overhauled more or less overnight their teaching and many decision-making processes, and think maybe about accessibility more than they have ever before, not just in the UK, but everywhere. Not all went smoothly, and we know that this massive transformation was painful for much of staff, academic and support, and of course students. Students had to adjust approaches to learning, self-planning, and expectations, and you just need to look at the mental health figures for students to appreciate how challenging this period has been. Not just students, but especially as education leavers, so those that have graduated. Nonetheless, given that in the grand scheme of things, this transformation happened in the blink of the eye, the scale and scope of this transformation in essential processes that took place last year to respond to the pandemic were truly impressive. Although the full impact of this big remake will only become clear in future, universities have seemingly successfully adopted and weathered yet another once-in-a-century challenge. And for many institutions, that wasn't the first time. They've seen pandemics, epidemics, wars, and other catastrophe over their long history. I mentioned my alma mater, I counted up 10 pandemics that it survived over its long history. In fact, in the UK and elsewhere, university enrollment has gone up in response to the pandemic. A larger proportion of young people than ever before are studying towards a university degree this year. In a time when the labor market is in turmoil, universities provide some security, and you might learn a thing or two even, and may gain access to a better job afterwards. So given the circumstances, higher education doesn't seem to be such a bad deal. But reviewing the last year as well demonstrates or reviewing the last year also demonstrates that there is great scope to remake higher education. It highlights also that maybe too often remaking higher education requires external pressures and forces. There seems to be a clear ability of higher education to react to this external pressure, and it has to. I think universities would not have survived and thrived how they did if it were any other way. At their heart, they seem to be rather conservative institutions that do what is necessary to persist. But thinking about all the transformation and potential to reinvent and remake itself, one wonders why it needs these external forces. Why do we see little changes that come from within higher education that is intrinsic to universities and higher education? For example, why have universities, especially at the top, resisted more action to change selective admission and its consequences? Until students can litigate or regulators push for it, universities seem resistant to change processes, and similarly goes with more or less half-hearted commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, climate actions, or recruitment of international students who cannot afford the 20K plus annual fees and maintenance per year. And that's just a few examples. In short, my pitch for remaking higher education is that universities may want to embrace some of this transformative power that they have, more willing use that to make good higher education more accessible for individuals and societies. Rather than transforming in response to external pressures, I would like to see higher education there to make remake through an intrinsic agenda. Let's leave it at that. Through an intrinsic agenda.
Thanks, Golo. The agency of higher education itself at the center of things. So there you are. So we've put students at the center and we've put higher education at the center of the higher education society relationship. Our next panelist is Maia Chankseliani, who is Associate Professor of Comparative, and I'll just get rid of this phone call. It's terrible, you know, when that happens. Is Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at the University of Oxford. And at CG, she researches in this large mapping supranational higher education space project, and where she's specializing especially in the Caucasus and Central Asia. She's a member of the CG Research Management Committee and leads the teaching program in comparative and international ed at Oxford. Maia.
Thank you, Simon. Welcome, everyone. It's fantastic to see so many familiar names. My brief intervention problematizes the developmental role of universities. Universities have had conflicting relations with society, keeping both engaged and detached, both asking for support and being supportive, both theorizing about societal problems and trying to find practical solutions. The ongoing pandemic makes the developmental role of universities more visible. In the last few months, some of the world's leading universities have been at the forefront of developing treatments and vaccines against the virus, researching and reporting on the societal impact of the pandemic, and advising governments. As universities start recovering from the crisis, there may be opportunities to reimagine the role of universities in societal development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by the UN in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There has been emerging scholarship on how higher education contributes to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, known as SDGs. In January this year, Tristan, McCowan, another colleague from CG, and I have compiled a special issue of the journal Higher Education entitled Higher Education and the Sustainable Development Goals. This issue shows how higher education can be seen and imagined as a driver for the achievement of all SDGs. Now, the discourses connecting university teaching, research, and engagement with the SDGs have been gaining momentum across the world, including in the low and lower middle income country contexts. Most of these discourses about the SDGs, its targets and indicators, however, rest on a set of assumptions, in particular the Enlightenment notion of progress, economic growth, and the idea of modernization. I like to call this the essentialist orthodoxy of development, and I explain this further in my contribution to this special issue. Overcoming the essentialist frame of mind about development and higher education's contributions to development requires a sufficiently expansive vision of higher education as a powerful space that can support individuals to realize their human rights and capabilities to pursue the freedoms that they value. Higher education's intellectual, humanistic, and aesthetic potential cannot be underestimated. Universities develop mathematical abstractions, insights into the Italian Renaissance art, or understandings of how human life started on this planet, and they teach about the history of humankind understood very broadly. While the SDGs provide a framework that allows the international development community to come together to promote and fund initiatives to achieve sustainable development, there are important questions about the extent to which the university, an institution oriented on widening intellectual horizons and developing individuals' intellectual capabilities to pursue their freedoms, can and should be held responsible for practical and immediate impacts on the world around, and whether any such responsibility limits the university mission or expands it. And if universities can and should deliver practical and immediate impact, what kind of support do universities require in global settings, and who is responsible for such support? I will stop here, and I hope we will have further conversations at the end of the panel and the conference.
Well, thank you, Maia, for sharing that compelling argument for higher education with 242 participants, which we currently have in the webinar, in the conference. Our next speaker in the panel is Yanya Kamaljenovic. Janja is a lecturer at Lancaster University in higher education and a member of CGHE's Research Management Committee. Her research interests include education governance, higher education industry, and the political economy of markets. And she's contributed to the CGHE webinar program in those areas. Janja.
Thank you very much, Simon. So the title of this session is Remaking Higher Education. And the description of the session asks, how can we transform the sector and its contribution to students, to more equal societies, and to a better world? To spark the debate, I'm going to be a little bit provocative on purpose. So instead of asking how should higher education be transformed, I will ask what should remain the same. Or in other words, if the university is one of the key society institutions, what are its key traits that need to be safeguarded? I'm going to focus particularly on one element of higher education, and it is that of social intervention or even activism. Universities are historically associated with social movements. The university is a space for critical thought, for reflection on society and its power structures, and for challenging social injustice. It has a potential for structural social intervention. But it seems that the academic community, including students and staff, are subject to conditions which work in the opposite direction. First, from the administrative perspective, the managerial approaches sparked by neoliberalism and the new public management led to key performance indicators and refocusing of attention and time. Instead of slow pace, we face calls for efficiency, fast results, and utilitarian measures of success in increasingly marketized systems. Second, as Paul Ashwin so eloquently argues, for students to have the potential for a transformative experience at university, they need deep engagement with disciplinary knowledge. Instead, the contemporary trends towards unbundling of the university experience might not support this kind of environment. And third, as I was discussing with Pavel Zgaga, is the academic perspective. The internal, professional, and peer dynamic might be questioned from the perspective of the theory of knowledge. What counts as true or accepted knowledge within academic circles? Which academic concepts and disciplines might at all support a more socially just world? Which knowledge is promoted at the expense of the other? And what practices of academics in their professional and private lives are considered acceptable? It is not uncommon that academic social activism might be punished formally or informally, even in their employing institutions around the world. So to conclude, I'd like to suggest that higher education needs public support and funding, substantial deceleration of temporality and pace, so reintroduction of slowness, and freedom for exercising critical thought and for challenging social problems and injustices. You might accuse me of being romantic, as traditional universities were also full of problems such as sexism, racism, and other internal struggles, but I wanted to focus on the essential role that universities play in social intervention, and most importantly, to spark the debate on the conditions that are needed for the university to exercise this social role, and how can we safeguard these conditions into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanya, and that was provocative and different, and I think worked very well. I think you're right. All of those reassertions of the foundations of good higher education would add materially to the experience. Our next speaker in the panel is Diana Laurillard. Diana is Professor of Learning with Digital Technologies at UCL in the UCL Knowledge Lab, member of CG's Research Management Committee, and leads one of our projects in relation to digital learning. She's a former Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning Technologies at the Open University, and her research interests include large-scale online communities of teacher designers and the use of digital course design tools to enable teachers to create and share new pedagogies in learning technology. Diana.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good day, I should say, wherever you are in the world. Well, given my title, the main idea here is to argue that if higher education is to achieve its potential for impacting on the big challenges that we've all been talking about, we'll need to overcome the rather unequal way in which our impact falls. The mission statements of universities are certainly ambitious, such as those from the two CG hosts: world-class research and education, which benefits society on a local, regional, national, and global scale. That's from the University of Oxford. Engaged with the wider world and committed to changing it for the better, for the long-term benefit of humanity. That's the UCL mission. Well, higher education certainly does have a critical impact on the world, and the pandemic has certainly shown that. But it's also shown us how the already huge inequalities in our society have been greatly increased in the face of disaster. So I'm offering just one simple contribution HE can make to reducing inequalities. That is, to scale up the value and reach of our professional development activities. Scaling up is essential because the challenges are so great. We all work to the UN SDGs, as we've already been hearing from Maia, and it's an explicit aim of our current transitional centre to work on supranational higher education and Moocs for professional development. Focusing on SDG 4 in particular, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. But for just education alone, HE shoulders the responsibility for educating another 60 million teachers by 2030 to achieve that goal of education for all. And what's more, education underpins every single one of all the other 16 SDGs as well. The professionals in those areas all need to know the latest research results and need to help in developing their own teams of employees in ways that reduce inequalities. So within CG, we're experimenting with these new ways of expanding and extending the impact of HE research outputs on the professionals who really need them, testing the feasibility of this model of collaborative professional development. And it does begin to show large-scale effects. In April 2020, we launched a MOOC on teaching online in Arabic, which has attracted now more than 46,000 enrollments across the MENA region, where teachers who once rejected online learning have now, of course, in the last year, discovered its value and the part it can play alongside conventional methods, but they need to understand how to use them. Well, that's a long way from professional development for the millions, but it costs almost the same to run a MOOC for 200 as for 200 million professional participants. So as a model for overcoming the unequal way the impact of HE falls on humanity across the globe, it's certainly worth testing. And I do look forward to discussing these ideas with you later in the conference. Thank you.
And thank you, Diana. Our next contributor is Tristan McCowan, and Tristan is currently in Ghana, and he's pre-recorded his short statement on remaking higher education, and Trevor will be bringing that up now.
Hello and welcome to the conference of the Centre for Global Higher Education. My name is Tristan McCowan. I'm Professor of International Education at the University College London Institute of Education, and I'm one of the researchers on the Mapping the Supranational Higher Education Space project as part of CGHE. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you live today. My thoughts on the conference theme, Remaking Higher Education. My first reflection is that universities need to regain their protagonism in society. Not to think exclusively in terms of adapting to external circumstances, to globalization, to other changes that are taking place outside, but to think of themselves as agents of change in society. And in a deep way that involves a civilizational change. The challenges of climate change and sustainability are paramount and involve changes in all aspects of society, which involve innovation, technological innovation, research breakthroughs, and so forth. But much deeper shifts in the political, economic, and cultural spheres. And that requires engagement of all aspects of the university through its teaching, its research, of course, but also community engagement relating both to direct services that universities provide to communities, but also their political engagements, their public engagements, campaigning and so forth, and also through their campus operations as well. And so shifts are needed in all of those areas, and it involves a coordinated activity from universities in order to work together with other actors in society to address those critical challenges of climate change and sustainability. An important change that needs to take place in universities that's closely connected to that relates to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the creation of an ecology of knowledges. An extremely important task for universities that will allow us to move towards a more just global sphere. This does not involve the removal or eradication of conventional forms of Western scientific knowledge, but the placing alongside it of other modes of knowing, other languages, other cultures in dialogue within the university space. And finally, we need to make sure that these processes take place across all parts of the globe. We need higher education and higher education of quality in every country, in every context. It's important to have some star institutions that are bringing breakthroughs in particular areas, but it's not enough. We need high quality institutions in every part of the world. And that involves a transformation not only of institutions, but also of the entire global higher education system. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good conference.
And Tristan is a co-investigator on our project on mapping supranational higher education space, and he also leads a major research project on higher education and climate change, and I do hope he's been able to connect during this session. I thought that was a terrific summary of the role of higher education across the world. Our final panelist is James Robson. Now, James leads the Master's strand on higher education at the University of Oxford. He's a member of the CGHE Research Management Committee and is a collaborative investigator on the CGHE project, which is focusing on the role of research in higher education. He works on the intersections between tertiary education, professional learning, skill supply and demand, employability, graduate labour, digitalisation and social mobility. So with all of that in his kit bag, James.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. In 1848, Marx and Engels in their manifesto famously wrote that a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. In 1993, Derrida adapted this phrase for his book, The Spectres of Marxism, where, among other things, he develops the theory of hauntology. Combining the words haunting and ontology, this concept refers to the ways in which ideas from the past persist in the present. Derrida's focus was on the way Marxism haunts modern society from beyond the grave. However, in 2021, higher education, in my opinion, is haunted by a very different kind of ghost, the ghost of human capital theory. In HE systems around the world, human capital theory can be seen underpinning the ways in which the relationship between HE and the economy is conceptualized and structured in policy, practical, and discursive terms. The basic idea is deceptively simple, that investment in education will lead to some kind of return, usually financial, within the labour market. Learning equals earning. This lies behind the current policy emphasis on employability and thinking about the contributions of HE in purely economic terms. And it drives linear skills policy, rooted in a view that education systems must simply respond to the needs of the labour market, supplying graduates with the skills that employers demand to give individuals the best returns on their investments. Now, numerous authors, including many of the people involved in this seminar, have provided detailed critiques of the ways in which the current relationship between HE and the economy risks both marking and perpetuating social and economic inequalities. It reduces educational value to purely financial terms, only values what we can measure, and makes us slaves to, in Sandel's terms, the tyranny of merit. Hauntology provides a useful heuristic device for understanding how this relationship is rooted in the ideas of a group of American economists from the 60s, a time marked by significant economic growth, social mobility, and a jobs market hungry for all the skilled labour it could find. It helps us to see how anachronistic this is for the present tertiary sector and economy, particularly given the disruptions caused by COVID-19 and accelerating technological change. There can be little doubt that we need to rethink and remake higher education in a more equitable way. This must be holistic. However, I would argue that to drive change across the sector, we must first reconceptualize the relationship between education and the economy, specifically problematizing the linear idea of skills, supply and demand. The ghosts of human capital theory continue to position education systems in a subservient relationship to the labour market, the supply side to employers' demands. I would argue that we need to fundamentally disrupt this linear understanding of supply and demand and reconceptualize the skills and knowledge that young people develop. They should not be seen as a response to economic need, but as a force for social and economic change. My current research has highlighted the ways in which big business is undergoing a significant shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, in part driven by the attitudes of the next generation of workers demanding more socially conscious employers. Positive economic change is possible, and education must embrace the role it can play in empowering young people to challenge the economic status quo to make a greener, fairer, and more socially just economy and society. The tertiary sector must move beyond anachronistic, subservient relationships with the economy, and in my view, rebuild it in a way that empowers the next generation of workers to demand and enact change, and we conceptualize contributions of education in terms of public goods.
Thanks, James. And I think that's very convincing. And like Golo, you put higher education's own agency at the centre of the problem. So giving it a more proactive role. Now we've got a Q&A list, which is relatively short and I think allows new people to come in. So keep that in mind, everyone, in this very large conference group that we have, about 240 people. I'm going to call on Gerard Arif first, and then Solomon Zawalde. And we've got a couple more to follow, but put your comments or your questions in the chat and you'll be able to come in, I think. When speakers come into the Q&A, if they want to direct their question or comment to a particular panelist, please indicate who that person would be. Otherwise, we'll take luck on who comes into the microphone and answers the question. First, then, if we can find Gerald Arif. Are you there, Gerald?
Yes, I'm here, Simon.
Good. Fire away.
Thank you so much. This is my first attendance in this conference, and I hope to join every single one after this. So the challenge that we face in Indonesia that I wanted to ask David Mills and Rachel is basically how we can increase the inclusivity of the students, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. So I've been working in the online platform for the last 7 years, and now working as a vice rector in full online university. So I think the concept of quality assurance, the standards that David was talking about, is so important because there's a huge confusion in the Indonesian higher education ministry of what is good quality online learning, and as well as the challenges that Rachel saw in the 6 countries, I believe. That would be most interesting if there's any input on that. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Gerald. Really good to have someone from Indonesia, as we've had a little bit in our webinar program, but not enough. It's a really important country. You know, people forget about Indonesia too quickly. I think 270 million people, and a major higher education system, fastest growing science system in the world. There's a lot happening in Indonesia now in higher education. I'm going to bring in one more questioner before we move to some responses, and I've got David and Rachel already listed as respondents to Gerald. Can I bring in Solomon Zawalde at this point to add another strand to the discussion? Solomon, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Simon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question is not directed to anyone in particular, but it's for everyone, for all the speakers, and also for the Center for Global Higher Education, for the people who have organized the conference. And I'm just asking if enough thoughts and space and considerations have been given to racism, racial inequity in global higher education. So I'm saying, first, congratulations, as I said, for bringing the very topic of remaking higher education. I mean, it's wonderful to bring it forward so that people talk about the need to remake higher education for a more equal world. But I'm of the opinion that this remaking of higher education is a difficult task. Okay, even when critical scholars, like people engaged in critical internationalization work, have called for, say, exploration of the legacy of colonialism and globalization. People who have critiqued the global power dynamics, and I've seen a few topics on that here, but much of that work continues to be race evasive, continues to shun and ignore race as far as I'm concerned. And given the increased and very persistent issues surrounding race and racism around the world, okay, I strongly believe that we are in the midst of racial reckoning in higher education across the globe. So I don't know what to expect really. So where is race in the canon here? In terms of all the topics that this conference is going to address. Yes, I would like to hear from you and from all the speakers here. And yeah, I would be a bit disappointed if race and topics addressing racial inequity and racial equity in global higher education are not, coming up in this conference. Yeah.
Thanks, Solomon. Continuing the theme of your excellent webinar in our webinar series, I think you'll find that the issues of race and racism and decoloniality will come up, and hopefully quite a lot. I was hoping to address those issues tomorrow in my keynote in part, and others I think will be also talking about them. globalization of higher education is closely linked to coloniality and white supremacy. I mean, you can't disentangle those issues altogether. They are integrally related in the way the world's unfolded in the last 30 years of globalization in the sector. It's not just a question of the models of higher education that we favour, and who gets in and so on. It's also the knowledge, itself. The knowledge itself is integrally related to the dominant countries in the world and the way in which they've handled their role in the world in the last 200 years. And I think, that issue that Tristan raised about the ecology of knowledges as a way beyond the present hegemonic knowledge system, I think is a really important, step in moving away from what we currently have. But let me pass over to David and to Rachel in that order to respond to both Gerald and Solomon. David.
Great, thank you. Two great questions, two very different questions. I would love to address both of them. Actually, I'm going to respond, if I may, to Solomon's question, because I've been doing research over the last year myself on these inequalities, these racial divides in relation to publishing. Nigeria is a big and populated dynamic country. It only has 10 journals in the global Scopus citation index. So there's a whole exclusion of African publishing and knowledge production. It's linked to a discourse around predatory publishing, which means people ignore it all. So I absolutely take Solomon's point. There's this absolute need to think about these racial inequalities, these global inequalities, and how they're racialized. And until we can begin to think about how our systems, our ranking systems, our citation systems reinforce that hierarchy, we're not going to remake higher education for a better world. So yeah, absolutely. Let's keep talking about this. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Rachel.
Yeah, thank you for those two questions. I suppose drawing on the findings of our research, not only did we find this disconnect between what students felt and policy discourse, but there was also a similar disconnect between student perspectives about the impact of social characteristics and staff perspectives too. So in general, although there were some exceptions across the 6 countries, students were able to go into much more detail about how different social characteristics, including somebody's race or ethnicity, but also a whole variety of other things, impacted on what it meant to be a student and their experience of learning. And we felt that that kind of understanding was not really replicated at the staff level. So I think, first of all, there's an issue around awareness. And again, what I was talking about getting student perspectives much more into public debate, I think would help for that. But I think there are also differences in terms of models of equality that staff, as opposed to students, were working with. And I suppose, again, not all staff, but many seem to be working with a model that actually treating all students equally was the way to be inclusive. But I think quite a different message was coming through our student data about the importance of actually sometimes treating students differently in order to promote equality more effectively. And then I think thirdly, on a kind of fairly pragmatic, prosaic note, perhaps, staff also pointed to kind of the lack of data available on student social characteristics. So I think even in the cases where they felt that this was something important that they felt they needed to address, there was a sense that they just didn't know what the social backgrounds of the students in their classes were. So I think, again, that's kind of perhaps something else we can do at a very basic level in some countries to promote inclusive approaches.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to bring in Maia Chankseliani at this point before we move to some more people from the Q&A list. Maia.
Thank you very much, Simon, for giving this opportunity. I just wanted to quickly respond to Gerald Arif's point on quality assurance. Through my work, and I do a lot of work with different higher education systems and governments and universities in the former Soviet countries across Eurasia, very broadly, and quality assurance is at the top of their policies related to higher education almost everywhere. And this is part of the biggest global supranational, so to say, policy of Bologna process and European higher education area, which promotes very distinctively the creation of quality assurance system, accreditation agencies, standardization, core qualifications frameworks, etc., etc. Now, when we talk about these things, I think we need to be quite cautious about the benefits of quality assurance frameworks and standards, and all the bureaucracy that comes with it. I wondered if we wanted to think further about throughout this conference, whether such standardization and bureaucratization can actually impede intellectual curiosity-driven teaching and research, and also can impede what Tristan was talking about, David just mentioned, diverse ways of knowing, diverse ways of teaching and learning and creation of knowledge. When everything is standardized, when universities cannot decide the curriculum, they cannot actually decide, professors cannot decide what to teach and how to teach when it's all standardized. And of course, these are the biggest impediments to the development of institutional autonomy and academic freedom, which are central aspects of university that we absolutely need to keep as we move on. So that was my brief point. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Maia. I'm going to bring in a couple more people from the Q&A list, and then we'll have some responses. Already a couple of the panelists have indicated they'd like to hop in. I think Solomon's question is generating quite a lot of thought. Can I ask Akim Ayote Akinwale to come in if you're there, Akim? Hello, Akim. This can happen. People pop into the chat but don't necessarily pick up the opportunity to come into the Q&A. Jeanette Boater is the next person I have on my list. Jeanette, are you ready to come in?
Hi, yes, I am. Thank you very much. I think this is a very timely and a very pertinent discussion. And I think the panelists have all touched on various aspects of what I would like to raise. And that the world, and I've been doing trending, by the way, for well over a decade. And it's clear that the world is on the cusp of some very fundamental transition. And the future is very opaque. I think at the moment, no one can really predict where we're headed. We have some clues, but basically, what we've seen in higher education has been an avalanche of new role players, along with, you could suggest, the delivery, technological advancement. In fact, there's some estimates that suggest that over 65% of all new knowledge is being produced by the private and business sector. And that means it's outside of the traditional remit of what the university does, especially in regard to knowledge production. And then we also see a discernible shift globally to producing more skilled workers, and the talk for the fourth industrial revolution. And this is kind of is contrary to the kind of graduates that we normally associate with university education and research intensive institutions. So for me, the question is, what actually is the role of the university? And I think Janja touched on that a little bit. I don't know if I'm being a little bit out of line or maybe a little controversial, but are universities really tasked to produce skills, or should there be other institutions or entities that can accommodate what is increasingly evident given the massive social disparities in society, different calibers of students who actually have the right to access higher education? And for example, in the university that I've just retired from, in fact, the end of last month, the University of South Africa, we have close on 400,000 students. We have a huge enrollment in certificate students who come in for a one-year certificate to gain access to education and the possibility of hopefully articulating into higher forms of learning. It makes it incredibly difficult to actually define the role of a university. And I think this is just such an interesting discussion because the whole issue of quality was raised. Well, quality is
Jeanette, we'll have to move on. Jeanette.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll have to, because we're running out of time.
Thank you.
You've made some excellent points, and I think there's a number of people on the panel who would be happy to respond to those if we could get them in. Can I ask Lauren Bolts to come in at this point? Lauren, are you there?
Yeah, right here. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, so my question is for David. I wanted to pick up on how you mentioned the convergence that UNESCO's Global Convention might have on higher education. And might this cause the HE sector, like the global sector and then within nations as well, to become more homogenous, and what effect might that have?
Now, thanks, Lauren. In the manner of these things, of course, everyone's coming into the Q&A now, and we've only got about 6 minutes left, but I'm going to bring in Diana Laurillard and Paul Ashwin, who've indicated that they'd like to say something, and also David Mills, if we've got time as well. So can we begin with Diana Laurillard, please?
Yes,
Hello,
thank you. Well, I just wanted to go back quickly to Solomon's question, because I thought that was a very interesting issue for us to have to deal with, because all through the education sector, education has to somehow deal with and overcome the inequalities within the students who come to them. And by the time we get to university, there are many inequalities which have been created for the people coming into HE. And we can only open up to make it easier for young people who are disadvantaged to help them enter HE if we think about how to create those routes for people who arrive at the age of 18 and are not yet equipped to be able to take a traditional HE course. Now, of course, within the UK, we had a solution to that 50 years ago. We created the Open University. It was precisely there in order to overcome some of those. It was called, Second Chance University and so on. And it did show how you could educate people from having left school at 15 with masses of disadvantages. Now, these are not the same as racial inequalities, but racial inequalities lead to many other kinds of disadvantages. So we still have to address that somehow. So I think the HE sector as a whole could be much more imaginative. Now, all universities have access to the means to reach all kinds of students. And it would be very hard for a university to switch itself to being in something like the OU, but it can do some things towards that. Or we can have a greater mix of institutions that allow the kinds of routes that, that the previous speaker was just talking about. So I think it is our responsibility to attend to this and to solve these kinds of problems, no question. As I think Maia was saying earlier on, we have that responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Paul Ashwin, please.
Thanks, Simon. I think I want to kind of respond to Solomon and Jeanette, because I think what Solomon says kind of pushes us to a more radical agenda than we've discussed so far. To me, the response so far has been much how can we give different people access to what we do already, but what we do needs to change. So we need to think about how our knowledge becomes different when other people come into contact with it. And what's really important about that is that we recognize our expertise as academics, as institutions, and the limitations of that expertise. So there's no point in us saying, well, we know everything. What we need to be clear about is what we do know, but also recognize that knowledge always says more than it intends to. It always includes and excludes in different ways. And if we're going to extend the reach of that knowledge, we can only do that in conversation with more people. And that for me relates to Jeanette's question about, how is knowledge changing? Where is private knowledge? Where is university knowledge? And how do we, as higher education, work in partnership with a greater range of people? Now, my sense is that universities aren't terribly good at partnership. Universities' position on partnership is, well, we lead and other people follow. Rather than actually accepting the whole point of partnership is that higher education has to change. As it welcomes in more diverse students, the knowledge changes. As it works with others in society, the knowledge changes again. And we're only one partner within that, rather than the controlling partner. And so for me, both of the questions from Solomon and Jeanette push us to a more radical agenda about how is higher education part of society, rather than how does higher education frame society.
Thanks very much, Paul. And I agree with you, I must say. The webinar timing is running out. David, we have you on the call list, but I think I'd like to try and bring in Evita Rodriguez. I thought that her comment in the chat was really interesting. Evita, are you online? Can we bring you in?
Hi, good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, far away.
Yes. So my question was just that, given my experience as a student during the pandemic, I didn't see universities in India at least responding in terms of being slow or say understanding what students were going through. And the point that a speaker brought up about why universities need to be sort of slow paced right now instead of say focused on say completing your semester or completing your preset targets. I was just wondering if there's work around that, because not just reimagining higher education for 5 or 10 years, but even grappling with the changes that are happening right now. How are we accommodating students? Because in India, at least, we're seeing students drop out because universities are not accommodating them well enough. So any thoughts on that would be very welcome.
Thank you, Evita. I'm going to have to apologise to Zuhal Guban and Simon in Delhi. We won't be able to bring you in, unfortunately. I'm going to give David Mills a very quick last word, and then we'll have to close.
Thanks. Yeah, very briefly to Lauren. Thank you. Great question. Standardization, certainly the European higher education area has been accused of that. I think the challenge here is, as sort of linking back to the race question and what Paul was saying, is if you extend the conversations, if more people are in the conversations, you get a bigger diversity of views. And it seems to me that quality assurance is such a key conversation that we should have everyone involved in that, and trying to make a world where those conversations cross over the ways in which higher education also travels feels really important. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, and look, thanks everyone for a pretty good start, I think, to the conference. And as usual in our webinars, it really livens up towards the end of the Q&A. So just keep that in mind, everyone in the conference. Come in as early as you can in the Q&A, because it gets things going quicker, and we don't get the situation where our best comments run out of time at the very end. But thank you very much to the panelists, all really interesting and different contributions, good ideas, and all of them now retrievable. We can watch them all ad infinitum once the recording is posted on the CG website. Our next session at the conference is going to be the Burton R. Clark lecture, the annual lecture, which has been endowed by Adele Clark, the widow of the great scholar of higher education studies in the United States, Burton R. Clark, Bob Clark, as we all called him. The Burton R. Clark lecture will be delivered by Roberta Mailey Bassett, who's the global lead for tertiary education at the World Bank. You might say the leading policymaker, in a sense, in higher education at world level, although the bank's role is basically an advisory one in relation to national governments. It's a very influential and important place. And Roberta will give us, I think, a very good big picture. So come into Roberta's session. That'll be in 8 minutes' time. You need a separate login for that. And that session will be chaired by Ellen Hazelcorn. Can I thank all my colleagues on the panel for your cooperation with the chair, and for such a great start to the conference, and look forward to hearing much more from each of you during the rest of the sessions this afternoon and tomorrow morning. Bye for now, and we'll open up again in the main session in 8 minutes' time.